Hello viewers, welcome back. So here's a little insight into how I choose which anime I'm going to watch. I finish whatever I'm currently watching, take a stroll through my ever-growing to-watch list, carefully consider all the shows I haven't gotten to yet, and then typically end up watching something I probably just heard of that day on a random whim. I've been trying to make my anime schedule a little more structured and general this year, particularly in regards to making these reviews. Mostly this just means having something lined up before I finish the show I'm currently on and making sure I'll have time to watch it before that monthly deadline arrives. It's typically a step in the right direction if the show is already on my to-watch list. Bonus points if the DVD is already sitting on my shelf and I really have no excuse not to have seen it. Like this one. Episode 1 of Tokyo ESP introduces us to a Tokyo that's already being torn apart by conflict. Espers, which is just a blanket term for a person with some sort of psychic ability, have taken over the city, holding the Parliament building hostage. This is one of those shows that jumps right in, but to be honest, Episode 1 is not a good place to begin an explanation of this show. We're not really introduced to our main protagonist, Rinka, until Episode 2, which winds back the clock a bit to the day she first got her psychic powers. On her way to work one day, she spotted a penguin flying in a school of fish that no one else seemed to be able to see. One of the fish is absorbed into her, and suddenly she has the ability to pass through solid objects. I wish I could tell you this is given a proper, well-thought-out explanation, but well, we'll get to that. Rinka is soon joined by a boy named Kyotaro, who already has some experience with being an Esper, having the ability to teleport himself. Kyotaro is your typical good guy in a lot of ways. He's very much an idealist, enamored by the idea of using their abilities to become heroes and save people, even though he does acknowledge early on that what the people might need protecting from is other Espers. He's not the only one, but his main motivation for doing good is just because it's the right thing. Rinka does eventually get swept up in this idea too, but early on her main priorities are more practical things like keeping her identity a secret and making sure her powers don't get the people she cares about hurt. Tokyo ESP throws us right into a lot of stories actually, introducing a few other Espers. And I found them all to be interesting, likable characters, but looking back, their personal stories don't really have much to do with the main plot. But I did feel that their inclusion had a lot to do with how enjoyable the show was overall. There was Kuroi, a thief with the power of invisibility, who quickly became one of those not-quite villains. Ayumu, a boy with precognition whose mother is a politician who's basically campaigning to rid the city of all Espers. And Murasaki, who I'd say is the most important. She starts out as just a regular little girl who's found and adopted that flying penguin Rinka saw. Rinka and Kyotaro have to save her when she gets kidnapped, and frankly, Murasaki makes one of the fastest transitions from victim to fighter that I've ever seen. While in captivity, she sort of loses patience with being a liability, as she puts it. One of those magic fish finds her and grants her the ability of psychometry. By touching an object, she can learn its and its owner's history. Murasaki's story is important to bring up for more than just because I really liked her character, though. A few different plot points are brought up here. Our main villain, who hasn't even been introduced yet, is responsible for releasing the fish into the city, but he doesn't really control them. One of the other characters states that the fish decide everything. They choose who gets to have their inner abilities awakened. And the second point is Peggy, the penguin. Murasaki's kidnappers were also Espers, but Peggy is able to take back the leader's fish, eating it and removing his abilities. I'll come back to both of those points, too. I think it's about time to introduce the main villain. He calls himself the Professor, and he and his daughter Minami are recruiting Espers to help build a better world, which of course means tearing apart the old one first. I know, this sounds like a really generic villain goal, but without going into spoilers, I will say that they're given a really compelling backstory. I mean, it doesn't excuse his actions or cover up the holes in his reasoning, but it is at least totally understandable that he went off the deep end. But now that they're in the picture, I think it's time to bring up something else I really liked about this story. Tokyo ESP takes full advantage of its mature rating. There's plenty of blood and swearing and badass fight scenes, but nearly every character is given a really heartfelt family story, too. Without even touching on the main characters, I was a big fan of Ayumu, whose entire character is defined by his relationship with his mother, who doesn't know that her son is one of those espers from which she's proposing they take back their city. I haven't even mentioned Rinka's dad yet, who is a total badass in his own right. I was prepared for this to be one of those stories where the main character has to hide her abilities from her totally normal family, but that's not the case. Rinka's dad becomes an esper the same day she does, and he's just as important to the story. It was just the two of them, and they're very close. He taught her to fight before she was ever caught up in this magic war, and while he is protective of her, he also understands her need to help people now that she has the power to do so. The most obvious family story should have been the one between the professor and Minami, our two villains, but they throw a curveball at us there, too. It turns out that these two are Kyotaro's adoptive father and sister. His biological parents died in some foreign war, or so he believes anyway. But this relationship, which felt like it should have been the most powerful story, had the least impact. When this is revealed, Kyotaro isn't surprised. He'd already suspected they were behind this, and it doesn't shake his resolve at all. He's already accepted that doing what's right in this case means fighting his family, possibly to the death. I was kind of disappointed by this, but to be honest, that's kind of true about Kyotaro in general. He's right at the center of this story, but of all the characters, he grows the least. Not even learning that his parents didn't die the way he thought they did seems to really affect him. He was a very static character throughout, which didn't feel quite right for one of our main leads. To be honest, a lot of the time Kyotaro felt more like a symbol than a character. Like I said, he was the generic good guy, the one Rinka could think back to when she needed inspiration in a tough moment. Kyotaro spends a good chunk of episodes kidnapped. He can't break out himself, his friends are in no position to rescue him, and in the end, Minami just lets him go. And it really didn't impact the story much, apart from giving Rinka a reason to get serious about her training. And Kyotaro wasn't the only disappointing thing about this story. There are a lot of aspects of this story that don't make sense or are left unexplained. We've got some very flashy villains. The professor wants to make his presence known, and pretty soon the public views espers as being synonymous with terrorists. The way he talks, it's clear that he views espers as being a step above humanity. Rinka does bring up the obvious hole in their plan, that espers are human, and any world they try to create with just espers is going to include all the same human evils they're trying to escape, especially considering the type of people they're recruiting. But this is just a passing moment that's never properly addressed again. Not to mention that near the end, the professor releases the fish back into the city en masse, so there will be more espers than ever. What was the point of killing as many normal people as possible if you were just going to make most of them the superior beings you wanted? At least, I assume it will be most. It's never explained how the fish decide who is worthy. It can't stem from inner goodness or righteousness, because most espers immediately use their new powers to destroy the city and kill people. And then there's Peggy. The professor calls him the Collector, a kind of natural safeguard that's meant to keep the fish in check. And we see in Murasaki's first episode that he does have some power to take away an esper's powers. It might have been nice if he did this more than once. I would like to address the professor a bit more too. So I really liked a lot of the fight scenes in this show. The big dramatic moments when our villains are threatening to, drop a battleship on the city were good too, but what really stood out to me were the smaller scale fights between two espers, because it called for some creativity. Because they do all have superpowers, but those powers are all limited in some way too. Rinka can pass through solid objects, but not living creatures, so she's safe from weapons, but it's shown early on that fists can do just as much damage, and this isn't one of those shows where the characters magically recover from their injuries just in time to save the day. Ayamu can see the future, but only the very immediate future, and sometimes he loses track of what's actually happening versus what's about to happen. If Murasaki uses her psychometry on a weapon, she can borrow its owner's abilities, but only for a short time because her muscles haven't been conditioned to keep up with that sort of rigorous fighting. It reminded me of a game I used to play all the way back during my daycare years, because of course we wanted a game where we all had superpowers, but even as little kids we recognized that the game would be a lot shorter and a lot less fun if we were too powerful. The only one who seriously walks that line of being overpowered is the professor, and he's only walking the line because his abilities aren't explained all that well. At first, he tells our heroes he has the ability to create illusions, supplant images into people's heads. Then it seems like he can imagine things into being, but the limits of this aren't clear. He can make imaginary things real, but can he also imagine things that really happened out of existence? That seems to be the case in certain scenes, but if it is, he could have just rewritten the event that started all of this. And then, when the professor and Minami are holding Kyotaro prisoner, he has the ability to block Kyotaro's teleportation. For some reason. Fans could probably theorize for days about all of these things. Does the professor get to decide what is and isn't real within a certain proximity to himself? Do the fish respond to just a general desire for power? But I would have liked a proper explanation. I feel like a significant chunk of this review, for a show that I did enjoy, has been nothing but complaints, but we're not done quite yet. Lastly, I would like to talk a little about episodes 1 and 12. Episode 1 has never sat well with me, even after seeing the rest of the show. There are a lot of technical problems that, thankfully, don't persist throughout the rest of the series. The voice acting is at its shakiest, likely because we see very little of our major characters. I'd imagine the majority of the voice acting in this one was done by extras, people brought in just to voice all these random policemen and civilians. Which isn't to insinuate that these people didn't care, but I doubt they could have understood the story that well, which wouldn't be that different from your typical viewer starting out. I have nothing against foreshadowing or stories that start in media res, but taking the entire episode to show the climax of this conflict and tense political climate that's been heating up until now, without taking a single step back to explain anything until episode 2, I could easily see some viewers dropping Tokyo ESP after just one episode, which is a shame. Don't get me wrong, episode 1 is a mess. It's just one action scene after another between characters you don't know yet, and the music is balanced very poorly, practically drowning out the dialogue you're struggling to make sense of in a lot of places. But it's not a good reflection of the rest of the series, which is told in a pretty straightforward way. The exception being the last episode, which finally brings us back to this conflict episode 1 introduced us to. After a 10-episode run that had done a lot to redeem the introduction, I was looking forward to seeing how Tokyo ESP would be wrapped up. Well, the short, non-spoiler way of explaining it is that it isn't. Tokyo ESP had one of those bullshit non-endings that literally just drops off. Even that one battle between our heroes and the professors is kind of put on hold mid-fight. The credits start rolling while the characters are explaining what's happened since then and what's left for them to do. I know it was based off of a manga series, but it's not even one of the obvious go read the manga endings. It's not really left on a cliffhanger or some major new development. And I could have been fine with the ending still having an air of this problem is too complex to be neatly wrapped up with one battle, but not because they just ran out of time to write and animate a more conclusive ending, which is the way it felt as is. Personally, I hate that feeling of, what could they have done with just one more episode? So this has left me in a bit of a predicament. It feels a little weird for me to recommend a show with the side note that the beginning and end are kind of terrible, but the middle was really good. Before I watched the final episode, I was prepared to liken Tokyo ESP to Gargantia, a show that was perfectly good, but just didn't go the extra mile to stand out and be great. Episode 12 puts a bit of a wrench in that description, because for me, a shaky beginning can be forgiven fairly easily, but the way a series ends plays a big role in my overall enjoyment of the show. Even so, this is still an anime I would recommend you see if you haven't already. If anything, Tokyo ESP has reminded me that there can still be value in shows that are kind of disappointing when all is said and done. I wasn't impressed with the beginning or end, but I did really enjoy it for the 10 episodes in the middle when I was kind of just along for the ride. I could see myself watching it again someday, if only to relive some of the heartfelt character stories throughout, and that's enough to earn Tokyo ESP a place on my shelf. Thank you for watching.